The Nestorians were really interesting. When I did my study of early Christian history, what I discovered was, and you're not taught this in evangelical churches that I went to, you're taught the history of Christianity is like, well, there's the New Testament, read the New Testament, and then the Catholic Church started, and then, we don't like the Catholics, they got off the path, and then they jump all the way to the Reformation, and then go, okay, and that's when we all straightened it out, and now we really got it all together. And so they go, and what they're talking about is what an historian would call the Western Church, right? The New Testament, you could argue, is not the Western Church, but eventually it became the Western Church, is what they're talking about. And the Reformation is the Western Church reacting to the Catholic corruption of the Church. And a whole branch of Christianity is totally left out. And that's what historians call the Church of the East. And the Church of the East included the Nestorians and other groups like the Jacobites. From the Church of the East, you get streams of Eastern Orthodox churches and some other things are like the Armenian Church. And so the Nestorians were one of those movements in the East. The movement was named after Nestorius. And at that time, most of the church still, all the way up until like 500 CE, the majority of the church, all the different church movements were Universalists. So the Nestorians were Universalists, and they went across Iraq, Syria, Iran, Turkestan, Armenia, Arabia, Yemen, India, and later China, sharing their message. But they had a very peaceful coexistence with the Muslims. From the documents that we have about what was going on, there was kind of a mutual respect. So it was a very interesting movement, and they were Universalists. They had some disagreements with other churches like Rome and Constantinople, but those were over Christology. Those were over things like, how do you define the deity of Christ? They believe Christ was two persons, divine and human, and that he wasn't mixed into two natures. And so because they had that kind of a nuance on their belief in the deity of Christ, that didn't line up with the supposed Orthodox view, and so they were considered heretics and they were kicked out of the church. But the other interesting thing is they weren't kicked out because they were Universalists. They were kicked out because of this Christology argument, which is interesting. At the time that they were kicked out, which is probably, 5th, 6th century, that era, Universalism was still so prevalent that they weren't picking fights with Universalists at that time. So that's very interesting.